Chapter 8. Liberation. From what does distraction distract the spirit? If the flesh, the world, and the devil impede the proper movement of life, they must impinge upon something deeper than themselves or degrade something better. But what is this deeper or better thing? Those who regard spirit as a separate substance, and spiritual life as essentially another life in another world, seem to solve the problem clearly. But I fear they would find it still on their hands if they actually passed into that other world. The moral adventure of existence would simply have been extended. And if that life were really life, and that world were really a world, the spirit would find itself there as much entangled and beset, if not as much tormented, as it ever was in the human body. So too, if we suppose spirit to have first inhabited some celestial sphere, according to the Platonic myth, evidently even in that sphere, if we take the myth literally, the spirit must have been subject to distraction. How else were its incarnations determined, or how else was it tempted to quit heaven at all? From the beginning, those two ill-matched horses gave the charioteer no end of trouble. And if we choose a milder fable, and conceive a Garden of Eden where all was health, safety, and abundance, we evoke only an animal placidity, into which spiritual joy might break perhaps at rare intervals, and, I should think, wistfully, because animal peace, to spirit, is half cloying, half pathetic, except that some fleeting posture or aspect of it may be caught up and turned into a lyric note or a charming picture. And why are such pictures or notes momentarily satisfying to the spirit, when the life from which they are drawn, in its monotony and decay, seems so gross and melancholy? Because spirit is essentially a culmination, and perfect happiness a quality to be attained occasionally by natural life, not another non-natural life existing beyond. To say that we are distracted here because we belong by nature to a different region is simply contrary to fact. Nothing could bloom more naturally, or tremble and sing more congruously, than spirit does on earth. And the myths about a paradise, past or future, are transparent parables, expressing the rare, transporting, ecstatic quality that distinguishes the culminating moments of natural life from its endless difficulties, hardships, and embroiled hopes. These moments are sometimes the gift of a happy change in circumstances, as when agony ends and lovers are reunited. But sometimes, more spiritually, the supreme moment liberates us from circumstances altogether, and we feel withdrawn into an inner citadel of insight and exaltation. Let us consider how this can be. Apocalypses and last judgments and cosmological wonders interest our moral or political passions. They give us a foretaste, conceivably not false, of catastrophes and triumphs awaiting the human race. They need not be inspired by a narrow partisanship, but may contain spontaneous insights into the genesis and fate of life in 1,000 non-human or superhuman forms, dreams of angels and titans, of gods and devils. Like inspiration of any kind, such revelations may bring to light and may fortify the rebellion of the psyche against oppression and hopeless routine. So far, the thunders of prophecy, political or cosmic, will give voice to the spirit and may promise to emancipate it. They may awaken it when perhaps it was sleeping, but they are not needed and not satisfying. Not needed because clear and varied notes, enough of the spiritual gamut, are struck spontaneously at every turn in daily life, even if drowned in the hubbub, and not satisfying, because those lurid transformations of the scene into hells and heavens, or into marches and countermarches of reforming hosts, only redouble the pressure of circumstances upon the spirit, and browbeat it into being joyful or revengeful. All this may involve fevers and nightmares of singular violence, but short-lived. Nothing can be more dead than dead prophecies. The shouts of triumph in one camp cannot render the spirit, which is universal, deaf to the groans of the other. And by the indefinite prospect of fresh revolutions and fresh catastrophes, far from being redeemed, the spirit is tied more excruciatingly than ever to the wheel of fortune. The Indians, who gave themselves time to unravel this question without private prejudices, saw that salvation could come only by not being born again, not because another life was not possible and might not be more splendid, but because being life, it would be subject to accident, confusion, and responsibility. It would be essentially distracted. But not being born again is a negative solution, and personal. The very notion of being born again confuses the psyche with the spirit. For the spirit is inevitably born again, so long as there is consciousness anywhere. Whereas the psyche might perhaps be restored to life by the resurrection or recreation of a corresponding body, but would lose its identity in proportion to the transformation suffered by this body and by its habitat. If the moral heritage or will of any soul were extinguished by discipline and penance, so much of the transmissible energy or burden of existence would be destroyed, and the universe would continue to live somewhat diminished in volume. I have not read anywhere that the universe was at last to be totally extinguished by this process, the last man being a saint, by whose salvation existence came to an end altogether, nor would such a prospect make any difference in the moral issue. Under the form of eternity, that finished history would remain a fact, with all the beauties and horrors that it may have contained, and the spirit said to have quitted it would still be faced by that fact, and be condemned to digest it forever, if by poetic license we conceive the spirit to survive disembodied. Salvation, then, must not be the beginning of a new life, which would make salvation again urgent, nor can it be existence without life, which, except for dead matter, would be a contradiction in terms. When each sage reaches nirvana or reverts to perfect identity with Brahma, who then is it that is saved? Certainly not the man, for he has abandoned and disallowed his personal being, even to the extreme of assuring us that he never existed at all, that there was never anything but Brahma existing in him. Not the world, for this, even if with some diminution of potency or debt, continues to wag. And surely not Brahma, or the trance of nirvana itself, for this has never been and never can be troubled. How then is spirit ever liberated, when in its proper nature it was always free, and in every phase of vital illusion it is still captive? I think the Indians themselves give us the key to this enigma when they tell us that, in reality, The departed or finite being never existed, but only the One or the Absolute existed in him. This assertion, taken historically or psychically, is indeed self-contradictory and contrary to fact, for only the finite and transitory property exists. But two genuine insights are conveyed by that mystic formula. In the first place, there is one plane, that of matter or physical energy, on which the universe forms a single dynamic system and is presumably of one substance, so that all other realities, not being possessed of any substance, force, or permanence of their own, are called unrealities by the impulsive realist. On this analogy, mind in its turn may be reduced to an alleged spiritual substance, as the dissolution of bodies or worlds turns them all into water or ether or electricity or dust. So the dissolution of ideas and emotions is conceived to leave pure spirit, deep sleep, Brahma, or Nirvana standing. Thus, as matter was, in a dynamic sense, the only reality in this variegated world, so pure and calm spirit may seem to have been the only lasting reality in our distracted consciousness. Modern philosophy has enabled us to dismiss this notion of an underlying substantial spirit. There is something substantial underlying our feelings and thoughts, but it is the psyche, or the organic life of the body, the substance of which, in its turn, is the common matter of the whole universe. Spirit is as far as possible from being a substance. It is at the other end of the scale, the very flower of appearance, actuality, light, and evanescence. But in the second place, the Indians, in telling us that Brahma was always the only reality in our lives, summon us to turn from that physical problem about the one substance in the cosmos to the moral problem of finding the quintessence of peace and joy in ourselves. Their philosophy here takes the same turn that Greek philosophy took in Socrates, and substitutes morals for physics. Now, morally considered, the only reality is the good. To say that Brahma is the only reality in our souls will then amount to saying that the only good in our thoughts and feelings and in our whole existence comes from pure spirit being alive in us. In fact, spirit in our thoughts and feelings is terribly distracted, but it can be more or less so. And the nearer we come at any moment to spontaneous, disinterested, pure intuition, so much more nearly has spirit within us been freed from ourselves, and so much more completely have we become, in that act, identical with Brahma. There was something in us always, since consciousness awoke, that saw our persons as part of the world. From the beginning, there was a moral ambiguity in our souls. We might identify ourselves with the self which we found existing and at work. We might adopt its passions and limits. We might almost forget that there might be other selves or other passions morally as real as our own. Yet such egotism is naturally unstable and perverse, because in seeing our persons as part of the world and at work there, spirit in us cannot help assimilating our action and fate to that of the other creatures visible in the same world. And sincerity then compels us either to admit the other wills as equally important and legitimate with our own, which would undermine our fighting morality, or else to detach our genuine allegiance from ourselves also, regard our passions as follies, our views as illusions, and identify ourselves not with ourselves, but with the spirit within us. This spirit will be qualitatively the same as exists, or may exist, in other creatures also, not insofar as each accepts and pursues his animal or political impulses, but only insofar as, like spirit in us, he detaches himself from those impulses, regards them as pathetic accidents, and equates them with our contrasting impulses and those of all other creatures. Physically, existentially, historically, nothing will be changed by this second insight, but morally the whole natural world, with our own persons in it, will be removed to a distance. It will have become foreign. It will touch us and exist morally for us, only as the scene of our strange exile, and as being the darkness, the cravings, the confusion in which the spirit finds itself plunged, and from which, with infinite difficulty and uncertainty, it hopes to be delivered. Thus, when the Indians tell us that only ignorance makes us suppose that a world exists, or that we have a natural self living in that world, I would understand them to speak of moral ignorance only, for they themselves hardly believe, for instance, in the transmigration of souls, or, what is morally the same thing, in karma. Spirit therefore has a long, variegated experience of this ignorance, which is at the same time knowledge of the world, and of the path to salvation, and the created selves that obscure and distract spirit in this process are parts of the vast realm of Genesis, with all its earths and heavens. It is not scientific or natural ignorance to discover and understand this too real machinery, but it is ignorance in the heart, ignorance of its spiritual vocation to attach itself absolutely to anything relative. Those sufferings and triumphs weigh upon spirit only because they arouse spirit, otherwise they would be indifferent and morally null, and they are good rather than evil, true monitors rather than false, only insofar as they liberate spirit and pass into it, as oil shines only when consumed and turned into flame. Once lighted, this flame turns back upon all that illuminates, and upon its own fuel, as upon alien, if not hostile, facts. Being light, it thinks it shines of itself, but this is only the most inward and subtlest form of its distraction, when it torments itself about its own existence, perpetuity, and prerogatives, instead of simply shining upon all that there may be to shine upon, and consuming all its gross substance in that spiritual office. It is from the fumes of untoward matter obscuring the flame that liberation is needed, not from the fit occasion of this burning. The burning forms the flame that is to be saved from its own impurities, from its obstructions and vacillations, so that it may neither suffer in shining nor fear not to shine. That it should cease to shine here, upon these circumstances, from this old animal center, follows from the natural instability of existence, and of the world in which spirit is kindled. To have lighted those things once is enough, if not too much. In any case, they cannot lapse from the purview of spirit, which is addressed to all truth. They cannot lose their pertinence to that spiritual life which they once diversified. Much less can their passing prevent other occasions and other objects from arousing spirit afresh. Frankly, this irrepressible vitality of that fire which, by its very essence, is continually consuming itself and ceasing to be, devours rather than sustains the animal soul. and those elegiac sentiments which gather round death, loss, old age, and mutation are not in the least modified by the assurance that truth is eternal, and that life and beauty may be perpetually renewed in other shapes. On the contrary, both the eternity of truth and the vitality of nature merely perpetuate the reign of death and of sorrow, and far from promising an escape from destruction, they overwhelm the natural soul with a sense of how thorough that destruction is, how pervasive, minute, and hopeless. To be told that spirit may be inwardly emancipated from fortune, and that in innumerable other creatures it may live through endless adventures, sounds like bitter mockery to the poor wight, mourning the loss of all his treasures, and shuddering horribly before his open grave. The soul so much concerned about its immortality is not spirit, but is an animal psyche, a principle of natural impulsive life. As thunderbolts, floods, famines, and wars, sickness and blindness fill this human soul with horror, and as social obloquy torments it morally, so when by a sudden ray of intuition it foresees its own end, it is appalled, and sometimes the thought of resurrection in the flesh, sometimes that of immortality for the soul only, arises in reflection to mitigate that despair. Both these thoughts spring from the same intelligence that brought the knowledge of death. Life is a perpetual resurrection, and spirit too is continually being born. In essence, it is incapable of growing old, or weary, or embarrassed by past errors. Wherever there is existence, there is youth, and death at every stroke, by intercepting memory, restores spontaneity. In another direction, all that perishes in time is in truth and, for spirit, raised to immortality. Life moves on, but the achievement of life remains undeniable, even if forgotten. Here are two honest counterparts to death, not adventitious hopes or hypotheses, but implications inherent in the fact of death from the first. Resurrection is involved naturally, though not logically, in death, because life is a self-repeating trope, a rhythm in which death is the caesura, and ideal immortality is implied logically in the truth of any finished life, which death rounds and frames in its wholeness. The phoenix that continually rises again, however, is no individual psyche, but mere spirit, not impersonal, since it can exist only in some person, yet not the past personality of any dead man, only the same rational light breaking out anew in some fresh creature. Such a resurrection of the spirit does not liberate it. On the contrary, in this new incarnation it must begin its redemption again, or at least continue it, if by a moral heredity the new psyche takes up the task where the old psyche left off. This is not only the Indian and Platonic doctrine, but in principle also the Christian. The number of incarnations is reduced to 2 or to 3 if we admit purgatory. But spirit wakes in the second life with that degree of moral virtue which it had achieved in the first. This rank it now retains in each soul forever, either in hell or in heaven, or else, according to Origen and some modern Protestants, it continues its moral adventures in circumstances perhaps more favorable than those it lived in on earth. We are not told whether the test of progress in either case would be an approach to liberation from existence altogether, as the Indians and other mystics aver. Probably not. The picture is rather that of an endless process, monotonous or varied, but essentially quite empirical and naturalistic. Resurrection is the good old Hebraic hope. Such a prophecy satisfies the moral or political enthusiasm of the prophets, and promises relief and compensation to Job. It does not profess to disengage the spirit from accidental bonds. Suppose the prophecy came true and we began to live in the millennium or in the New Jerusalem. As we walked those golden streets and gazed at those crowned and white-robed phantoms that discourse music and eternal peace, and still solitary spirit within us might well ask whether all this was not a dream, whether the heart was not deceived and disappointed by it, and whether reality possessed no other dimensions. Spirit would still need to do what it does on earth, what it is the nature of spirit to do everywhere, namely, by its own intellectual insight, to introduce us into the spheres of truth or of essence, detaching us from each thing with humility and humor, and attaching us to all things with justice, charity, and pure joy. Is this what, after all, we should understand by heaven? In that case, the heavenly kingdom has already come and exists potentially within us, and there would be no occasion for spiritual pride to turn its back on heaven, since heaven would open wherever spiritual humility happened to look. No dramatic eschatology would be involved in such inward salvation. We should simply return to innocence as before nature in us was distracted, or we should achieve natural perfection in some particular faculty, for the moment predominant, say in poetic intuition or in universal sympathy. It is an error to identify a spirit with cold intelligence, or to think even intelligence primarily cold, however impartial our inspection of truth might become, and it never is wholly impartial. That very impartiality and scope, that very perception of contrary movements, crossing or ignoring one another, and all issuing in the least expected or desired of destinies, would excite a tremendous and exhilarating emotion in the heart. Spirit has its lyric triumphs in childhood and in the simple life, wedding days and moonlight nights, and victories in war and soft music and pious trust. It breaks out momentarily in the shabbiest surroundings, in laughter, understanding, and small surrenders of folly to reason. Such moments are far from permanently lifting the soul. They visit into a high spiritual sphere. Often they come to never-do-wells, poets, actors, or rakes. The spark dies in the burnt paper, yet it had the quality of a flame or a star. All the saint or the sage can add is constancy to that light, so that it colors all their thoughts and actions, turning the material circumstances into almost indifferent occasions. Yet the least disciplined or integrated of us sometimes feel within us, rising above ourselves, a culmination, a release, a transport beyond distraction. It was but summer lightning, and the sultriness continues unabated, yet that flash has given us a taste of liberty. This is a spiritual gift, a gift of grace. It is not an earthly or even a moral benefit. Against circumstances and vices there are natural correctives. To apply them is the task of war, medicine, and labor, but easier circumstances or healthier passions will not liberate the spirit from oppression by things not spiritual. Prosperity might even deaden and misguide it more completely than ever misfortune could. For instance, that erotic passion which moralists think of when the flesh is mentioned in a conspicuous source of inspiration and spiritual courage, for it entangles us in sordid complications. It liberates us from the drab world where everything suddenly seems foreign and worthless. The snares and slavery that love prepares for mankind are like venereal diseases, surprises for the young lover, shocks to his confident emotions in which nature and spirit seemed at last to have flowered together into an intense harmony. is then the flesh as a power that liberates us from the flesh as an obsession. That which is liberated is still love. It may ignore the flesh that breeds it. It may turn its rays away from their source upon the most remote or ethereal objects. It may even consume its substance and exhaust its organ. But that would be the end, not merely of all possible relapses into fleshiness, but of love itself and the blessing of its ultimate visions. Love presupposes a creature addressed to objects naturally harmonious with its deepest needs. Otherwise, love, if it could be imagined still to subsist, would be a blind, unsatisfiable longing, incapable of fixing upon any true object, or even distinguishing the predestined beauty for which it longed. We find, then, that it was not the flesh and its simple animal functions that imprisoned the spirit, but the world and the mind, complicating those impulses, or compelling them to hide, that overwhelmed the young Eros with all manner of extraneous reproaches, jealousies, sorrows, and cares. We should liberate the spirit quite enough from the flesh if we could liberate the flesh from all that, as flesh distorts, starves, and degrades it. Nor is it liberation for the spirit to be removed from the world. This, too, is physically impossible, but even in the sense in which a hermit or a lover of nature may flee from the world of men, liberation is problematical. It will not ensue if the hermit or poet still takes thought for what he shall eat or drink, what people will think of him, or how he may persuade them to reform their ways. As the flesh is the necessary organ of spirit, so the world is its inevitable environment, and its appointed theme when spirit is intelligent. Perhaps a purely sensuous, musical, or conceptual life might never discern a material or social world beyond the sphere of linked images. But when images are acted upon and understood, when objects, events, possibilities, and certainties loom before the mind, then spirit, by becoming intelligent, becomes a conscious and absorbed inhabitant of nature. It lives by finding itself in the world, by seeing how the world wags, by tracing with emotion the tragedies of history. The greater the range or deeper the insight of spirit, the more inextricably will it live the life of the world, though not as the world lives it. Ignorance is not liberation, and for that reason the world is such a slave to itself, not in the least understanding its own mechanism or foreseeing its destiny. But spirit, in the measure in which, by attentive study and sympathy, it may have understood the world, will be liberated from it, that is, from distraction by it. And as for the devil, all that mesh of deceit, which language, imagination, reasoning, and self-consciousness weave round the spirit out of its own creations, the devil needs indeed to be exorcised, but cannot be destroyed so long as spirit endures, because in their substance the two are one. We have seen how the distraction of the spirit by the devil reaches its height in insanity and suicide, on the way to which there are many stages and devious paths of sophistication, obsession, delusion, and fanatical pride. We need only follow the thread backward through that diabolical labyrinth to find the gate to freedom. Not always, or perhaps often, a gate by which we entered or which we recognize as opening upon fields native to our souls, because we are born in original sin, hatched within the labyrinth, and accustomed from childhood to be little spitfires and little devils, rather than innocent, clear minds. Yet, though probably never experienced, perfect health and simple knowledge would have awakened and filled full within any animal a spirit free from distraction, and so attuned to its successive intuitions as to find the devil's whisperings inane and utterly repulsive to this innocence. Armed with the strength of unclouded spiritual wisdom, we may penitentially return, but only a long discipline can avail in most cases to smooth out all sophistry and banish all pride, so that, undisturbed by the devil, spirit may deploy all its notes and all its tents in a new springtime of inspiration. Health and knowledge, essentially nothing more, is requisite for liberation from distraction by the flesh, the world, and the devil. Negatively, we may observe this liberation in placid sleep. A sleeping child is not distracted, yet he is alive. Nature has given him health. Fortune has not yet taxed his powers unduly. And while consciousness is in abeyance, the feelings and images ready to appear, informing his latent store of knowledge, will serve perfectly to express his simple contacts with the world. But spirit in the sleeping child is in what Aristotle would call his first entelechy. It is ready, it is perfect, but not employed. It must awake before all that brimming potentiality can pass into action. And then, after a first phase of confidence and eager experiment, trouble will begin. Foreseeing this, must we say with the Indians that liberation can come only by reverting to that deep sleep in which all things are alike and nothing ever happens? It would be foolish to deny both the physical and the moral insight enveloped in this doctrine, but discrimination is needed. There is, let us allow, a universal substance to which we all return, and which was always the real force and agent within us, and a worshipper of mere force, permanence, or existence may see in all that is evanescent, that is, in all that is in any honest sense spiritual, a vain delusion from which it is blessed to relapse into unconsciousness. This unconsciousness will not be death, because unconscious substance retains all its energy and potentiality, and will still breed, very likely, endless worlds out of itself. But in a spiritual sense, is this liberation? Is it even liberation from life, if you are tired of thinking, loving, hating, and hoping, and wish for eternal rest? It would be death indeed to you, if that is what you long for. But the unconsciousness of universal substance is immensely alive, else we should not be here, with our troubled, phenomenal world, and the end of spiritual troubles in you will not dry up the fountain of spirit or the endless distraction in the universe. The liberation, if you call death a liberation, will therefore be personal only, material, and unspiritual. The spirit will not have learned how to live, and to speak of freedom where there is no life, of freedom in non-existence, would surely be an abusive language. No, liberation cannot be liberation from spirit itself, and therefore not from those natural circumstances which make spirit possible. On the other hand, these circumstances plunge the spirit, as we have seen, into all sorts of distraction, since the organ of spirit, not by chance but essentially, forms a particular and specific nucleus in the organization of nature. Were not the psyche a special nucleus, subject to external interference and needing external support, it could never have become the organ of spirit, that is, of an intellectual and moral self-transcendence. Living suspended upon circumstances, the psyche felt the suspense, reached and covered those circumstances by its concern, and thereby became spirit. Individual life must subsist, with a station from which to survey the world, a set of organs and interests to canalize that survey, to render it graphic, lyrical, tragic, and moral. If ever spirit is to arise or to endure, or if in any positive sense it is to be liberated, yet how shall it be liberated if it must continue, while it exists, to face a world of circumstances not only alien in themselves, but often inimical? Between extinction on the one hand, and endless distraction on the other, it might seem that for spirit there were no salvation at all. Perhaps a surer and more positive idea of liberation may be drawn from observing what spiritual men are than by discussing what they say. They are not all alike. Some are initially spiritual and free, not needing liberation, but bird-like and gay like children, or bovine and steady like peasants. Others, who are more sophisticated, represent all degrees of regeneration, from comfortable worldly wisdom to the extreme of asceticism. Even frankly mundane sages, like Goethe, while blandly smiling on the world, the flesh and the devil seem to disinfect those influences by the breadth of their knowledge and sympathy, being too mature to run amok with any one folly. But such equilibrium seems rather the gift of a sound temperament than of a renovating philosophy. Nature at a certain distance and on a large scale looks sublimely calm, as if God lived there, but all is strain, torment, and disaster in the parts, if we take them on the scale of their inner effort and animation. So an Olympian naturalism lives in peace with all the vices, and is more selfish than sympathetic, thinking that inevitableness and beauty justify nature as they justify woman, no matter how much she may entangle or how much she may suffer. In such pantheistic allegiance and respect for nature as a whole, spirit may be philosophical, absorbed in curiosity and wonder, impressed by the size, force, complexity, and harmony of the universe. The eyes are open, but the mind is still in leading strings. So it would be in natural science. So it was in that happy childhood of philosophy represented by the Ionian cosmologers. Yet at 2 points, the existence of spirit, with its transcendental rights, is bound to assert itself. The naturalist, being a man, must also be a moralist, and he must find himself dividing this seamless garment of nature by a sort of optical iridescence into the shifting colors of good and evil, and he will probably turn his reflection from pure science to giving counsel to his soul and to his country about the wiser way of life. At the same time, within his natural philosophy, he must ultimately notice the existence of sensation and emotion in animals, with his own moral philosophy crowning that immaterial and invisible experience. He must discover the witnessing and judging spirit. This is the adolescence of philosophy, and has its sentimental dangers. Only in the most home-keeping, industrious, unheroic souls will spirit be content, when self-conscious, to accept reality uncritically and to run every errand of instinct or opportunity with the alacrity of a trained dog. Either overwhelmed by the disproportion between outer and inner forces, they will turn against themselves in the hope of suppressing all moral distinction or rebellion, or they will reserve the moral sphere as a private retreat, a humorous or sarcastic or poetical oasis for the spirit in the environing desert. This last was, at heart, the path chosen by Socrates and his less metaphysical followers, who were not also followers of Plato. Cynics and Cyrenaics, like Confucians and skeptics elsewhere, summon the spirit to live on its own resources in studious or domestic peace, dominating the world only intellectually, describing it sometimes scientifically, sometimes satirically, and cultivating abstention from passion and war, and from excessive confidence in fortune or in human virtue. The spirit, as these men saw, was invulnerable in its idyllic modesty, and far more divine than the thundering gods. Yet the authority of the spirit over the rest of the human soul remained precarious, and philosophy, when honest, had to be composed in a minor key. Minor, that is, in its philosophical pretensions, yet often merry and running into scherzo. For in fact this homely strain in Socratic wisdom had flowed ever since through all the pleasant fields of literature and worldly wisdom, while religion and science, not always more spiritually, frowned from the heights. For can it be regarded as a triumph of spirit to live, artificially exalted, on its own illusions? The zeal, the trembling anxiety, the fanaticism with which these illusions are sometimes defended betray their non-spiritual source. They represent psychic and political forces struggling to maintain a particular form of life and dragging the spirit into their vortex, which is by no means identical with the free and natural organ of spirit. No doubt, the metaphysical side of Socratic philosophy, the hypostasis of language and morals into cosmic powers, expressed spiritual enthusiasm and seemed to support it. Yet in the end, we find that it contaminated and betrayed the spirit. Earthly warfare against the world is an earthly and worldly business. It impoverishes its own side by condemning too large a part of nature and of human nature, which might also have served the spirit, and it constrains such spirit as it fosters in a false alliance with particular opinions and moralities. Spirit soon has to cry aloud to be saved from such salvation. Plato, who had the soul of a poet, knew perfectly how much he was sacrificing to the desperate enterprise of maintaining an impregnable and incorruptible city on earth. And the church afterwards acknowledged that on earth it was but a church militant. Triumph, liberation, happiness could come only in heaven. Mankind were to remain an enlisted army, heavily armed, narrowly hedged, covered with blood and mire. Spirit was to visit them only in the weariness of the twilight, and to rise heavenward in the smoke of their campfires. A dogged allegiance to a particular temperament or country or religion, though it be an animal virtue, is heroic. It keys the whole man up to sacrifice and to integrity, so that persons devoted to such a specific allegiance attain a high degree of spirituality more often, perhaps, than skeptics or original philosophers. Yet pantheism, or joyful allegiance to nature as a whole, also has its saints. It too, in one sense, is a special allegiance, since it excludes every irreconcilable passion. Indeed, what essential difference can it make to the liberation of spirit from what world or what passions it is liberated? To be liberated, let me repeat, is not to lose or destroy the positive possessions to which the spirit was attached. It is merely to disinfect them, to view them as accidents, to enjoy them without claiming them, to transcend without despising them. So we find the pantheists, when they are spiritual, retreating from this infinitely deployed universe into an inner silence and simplicity that holds infinity, as it were, in suspense. And we also find the disciples of particular religions interpreting their tenets as symbols or occasions for an inward revelation that renders those tenets indifferent. When St. John of the Cross, for instance, who knew that the accepted facts of religion did not prevent the spirit from passing into the darkest night, tells us that the one guide out of that darkness must be faith. What does he understand by this word? The dogmas of the Catholic Church? But those he never seems to have questioned or lost sight of. Any partial heresy seemed to him perverse, and he had no intellectual or historical lights to show him the whole system of Christianity from the outside, as one figment of imagination among many. Faith in that system, as a materially true account of the facts, had not prevented his spiritual desolation. How should it save him from it? The faith to invoke would seem to be rather faith in salvation itself, allegiance to the whole enterprise of the religious life, fides caritate formata. Trust that beyond that blank negation and inner death which utter self-surrender involved, there would come in the end a positive liberty, a clear vision, a living flame of love. And it could come, it did come, although even the most exquisite poetic inspiration could not avail to express its nature in adequate images. The verses of St. John of the Cross have the lyric brevity, simplicity, and passion that anonymous popular ditties in Spain borrow, perhaps from the East. There is something so entire, frank, and ultimate about such effusions, that they are not unspiritual even when merely amorous or witty. The man who sings them, and perhaps improvises them, sees himself and his feelings from above, as did Catullus when he wrote Odi et Amo. Here is a torment that, in seeing how animal it is, has become spiritual. At least it has become awareness of a double life. You are perishing in the sea of fortune and passion, and you are making a philosophy or a poem out of your shipwreck. Or while the whole world is asleep, you are slipping out invisibly into the night on the secret errands of your love. It was a godsend to Christian mystics that the Song of Solomon was canonical. It countenanced allegories that otherwise might have seemed scandalous. The flesh, as we have seen, is naturally a breeder of spirit. Even vulgar infatuation often touches ultimate insights. Defiance of the world, self-surrender, and spontaneous sublimation here may well be used as types of sublimation for all the passions. Yet I find two defects in erotic symbolism, even in the delicate hands of St. John of the Cross, in which it was comparatively safe, because he seems to have had a less erotic temperament or a more manly control over it than many other mystics. One defect is that, as in the Song of Solomon itself, the images overpower the thought, if indeed the thought ever existed, and we are charmed by a lascivious picture or a poetic sigh when we ought to be transported into a perfectly spiritual, entirely sacrificial bliss. The Indians, with their metaphysical intensity, are better guides here. The other defect is that lovers asleep in each other's arms on a bed of roses represent a pleasant death rather than a sublime life. Appeasement of a sensual instinct makes a bad symbol for attainment of intellectual light. The true spiritual sublimation of love is charity, not inebriation, or blind transports, or happy sleep, so that if in its imagery I find erotic mysticism less instructive than Indian concentration on pure spirit, in their issue I find both schools alike too negative, too drowsy, too unintellectual. Blank ecstasy is a form of intoxication, not of disintoxication. Instead of cleansing the lamp, it puts out the light. St. John of the Cross is now in great favor even among the merely curious in spiritual matters, because he is the most poetical and psychologically expert of mystics. But neither in speculation nor in heroism was his genius of the first order. What the essence of liberation is might be more readily gathered from St. Francis of Assisi, or from Buddha. One would teach us the cheeriness of utter renunciation, and the other its infinite peace. But I am not writing a history, and will jump at once to the supreme instance obvious to all natives of Christendom, obvious to believers, because where could spirit be freer or less tainted than in God made man? Obvious also to unbelievers, if they have any discernment, because at the moment when ancient civilization touched the summit of its greatness and of its misery, the Hellenized Jews were exiles in the midst of that world. They learned from it without loving it, and were weaned from their own national ambition and bigotry, sublimating these into a purely religious zeal, still filled with prophetic grandeur and fire. And to the heart of this new religion they composed the legend and maxims of Christ. Christ was Supreme Spirit incarnate in a human creature, suffering and dying guiltlessly in that creature, and immediately rising again and carrying with him into eternity his earthly body, strangely transfigured, and thus opening the way of salvation for the spirit in all flesh. What is this salvation? Not as the Christian myth describes it. We have settled our accounts with myth, but as the adored person of Christ exhibits it, and as his followers would experience it if they shared his passion and his resurrection. Christ in the Gospels continually tells us that he is subject to the Father, who has sent him into this world. Liberation, as a Christian should desire it, cannot be liberation from fortune or domination over it. Spirit is sent into this world. It does not command this world, much less create it. It may work miracles here when it feels the silent consent or monition of the Father prompting it to invoke them, but they are secondary, and the fuss the world makes about them is disheartening. The Father represents the realm of matter, where the sun shines on the just and the unjust, where to him that hath shall be given, where the lilies of the field flourish and the sparrows fall, where the house built on a rock will stand for a season, where the poor are always with us, and where there shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Miracles belong to that natural sphere, and manifest the hidden sympathies and harmonies between its parts. The Spirit knows them, but does not dwell upon them, or value them, except as evidences of the unfathomable fatherly power on which spirit itself depends. Jewish tradition unhesitatingly identified this universal power with Jehovah, conceived at once as a national patron and as the divine vindicator prophetically invoked by an aggressive conscience. But these strains are separable and not spiritual. The Father we hear of in the Gospels bears a more intimate and a more universal relation to the Spirit. He generates and inspires it, and at the same time subjects it to the chances and cruelties of an impartial natural economy. To this economy the Spirit submits painfully, yet gladly, because the beauty and terror of that impartiality liberate the Spirit itself from its accidental bonds. Family, race, religion, human conceit, human hypocrisy are transfixed by the clear Spirit in Christ with a terrible detachment. But where love is refused, this is not because it does not exist. It exists overpoweringly for everything that the Father has created, that is simple, that is young, that suffers and is mangled in the hideous madhouse of this world. Thus we see by the example of Christ that Spirit, even when conceived to have been originally disembodied and voluntarily incarnate, is neither contaminated by its descent nor made proud by its intrinsic elevation. In Christ, Spirit did not need to be saved. It was free initially, yet it was inspired to love and willing to suffer, neither tempted, like the gods of Greece, to become an accomplice to human passions, nor like Lucifer to shut itself up in solitary pride. It was humble towards universal power, wisely respectful towards the realm of matter. Salvation could not consist in pretending to be independent, that is, in becoming mad. It cannot consist in correcting the divine economy and becoming creative, that is, in becoming guilty. Humility, piety, is a prerequisite to spirituality. It is much more than a prudential virtue, good for those who wish to prosper in the world. It enables spirit to recognize the truth and to be inwardly steady, clear, fearless, and without reproach. Spirit is not the whole of life, only a child of the family. The others, the uninspired, cry out even more urgently and need to be helped first. The Good Samaritan is more spiritual than the Pharisee. Learning and science and art scarcely deserve to be mentioned, or only ironically, in that they refute and stultify themselves. Spirit, being at once vital and disinterested, cannot but be merciful. Wounds, weakness, conflicts are the immediate evils. When these are healed, we may turn to higher things. Nor is this last possible or necessary to everybody. The parting word rather is, sin no more. Enough to strike at the source of each grief, to staunch this wound, stop this pain, banish this care. Why force anybody to be greater than he naturally is? There is nothing enlightened in moral snobbery, and spirit feels more at home amid simple things, if they are perfect, than in ambitious minds. Its own perfection consists in charity, in the perception and love of possible perfections in all other things. Thus, the innate humility of spirit, not only towards the realm of matter, the universal power on which spirit depends, but also towards the realm of spirit itself, towards all the lives, languages, and loves into which spirit can enter. To corporeal works of mercy, Christ adds spiritual charities, patience, forgiveness, understanding, defense of the heart against cant, hypocrisy, isolation, and the insanities of conscience. Spirit that suffers distraction by the disorder of its instruments rejoices in the salvation and perfectness of all creatures and all aspirations, as in so many preludes or approaches to its own happiness. It is not spirit that sends, but the terrible cross-pressure of 1,000 motions in nature that stifle and confuse it, when they allow it to open its lips at all. St. Paul tells us that Christ liberates us from the law, and therefore from sin, saving us by faith and an infusion of the Spirit. This might be, and has been, interpreted so as to countenance moral license, as the charity of Jesus in the Gospels has been interpreted by sentimental or romantic moderns as an invitation to indulge all their corrupt inclinations. But health and morality are not based on spirit. Spirit is based on them, and no spiritual insight can abolish or weaken the difference between what nature allows and rewards and what she punishes and condemns to everlasting torments. The point is that spirit, caught in this vice, suffers guiltlessly for that natural disease and corruption, and to rescue that guiltlessness, to extricate spirit from inner madness as well as from outward oppression, is the double work of mercy proper to Christian charity. The moral economy of the universe is not destroyed or suspended. Rewards and punishments, saving miraculous exemptions, take their natural course. But sins are forgiven because they ought to be forgiven, because the suffering they bring to the Spirit never deserved. Is it too bold an interpretation of Christian dogma to say that This inevitable innocence of the spirit in all it suffers is symbolized by the passion and death of Christ and by his resurrection. The possible liberation of the spirit is not a liberation from suffering or death, but through suffering and death. This suffering and death need not be bloody. Often some silent spirit is overwhelmed like a modest brook grown brackish and lost in a tidal river. Suffering and death come from the contrariety of motions in nature. Among these, from the way in which life rises into spirit and sinks away from it. Yet the spirit, however cruelly circumstances may play with it, remains congenitally positive, self-justified, heroic. It has been sent into the world by the very power by which the world was created, and it aspires to live and to find a good and beautiful world to live in. It loves, and although it suffers only because it loves, it wills to love and to suffer. Our sufferings will chasten and transfigure our attachment to the circumstances and passions that cause those sufferings. Death will soon annul the ignominy that confines spirit in us to our private views and private interests. Even now, by accepting that death in advance, we may identify ourselves dramatically with the spirit in us that endures and surmounts those accidents and laugh at that death, since apart from those accidents, spirit in us is identical with spirit everywhere, a divine witness, a divine sufferer, immortal, and only temporarily and involuntarily incarnate in a myriad distracted lives. So the cross is a symbol for the true liberation, the ultimate dominion, possible to the spirit in man. Salvation comes by shifting the center of appreciation from the human psyche to the divine spirit. It is a shift within the psyche, otherwise it would not enter at all into our lives. But in each human soul, some spark of divine spirit cohabits with the animal nature of the rest, and shifting the living center from some other faculty to the spark, which is the focus of intellect, by no means abolishes the remaining faculties. These merely become, for appreciation, peripheral. This means a change of heart, a conversion, momentarily real, but relapsing and becoming more or less nominal and merely intended as life goes on. For genetically and substantially, these non-spiritual faculties were not peripheral but primary, and the nucleus from which intelligence and spirit were put forth, so that man is irremediably a human person assuming and adopting a divine nature, and not, like the Christ of theology, a divine person assuming a human nature added to and subordinate to his native divinity. This religious image is formed in worship. It expresses an unattainable limit of aspiration. It is hyperbolic. It represents as a descent from heaven that inward darkness which is in fact a presupposition to the idea of heaven. It would be heaven to shed all these backsliding inclinations and distracting cares, and to live only in the spirit. But spirit would have nothing to live with and nothing to live for, if it had begun and ended by being a spirit. For us to wish to become divine persons like Christ would be chimerical and, for the pious Christian, blasphemous. But Christ may come and dwell within us, transfusing our human nature with divine light, so that our natural functions, while continuing to be performed, and performed perhaps more healthily and beautifully than before, will now be performed with detachment and humility, and an eye seeing what lies beyond. The fact that spirit is grafted on the animal psyche, and is a continual hypostasis of natural life, prevents the sacrifices imposed by spirit from being unrewarded, and the spiritual life from being merely negative. Calvary is not the end. There is the resurrection. And this post-mortal life has two stages, or two dimensions. One is a rebirth by expansion and reincarnation in all those phases of spirit in which the spirit is free and therefore self-forgetful. Selfishness can see no difference in value between what is enjoyed here and what is enjoyed there, by one man or by another. Envy is abolished. The very limits of sense and imagination seem virtually to break down. You feel all you have not felt, know all you have not known, live in every one who has ever lived, yet with a happy partiality, because the endless evils and sufferings which fill actual lives fill them precisely because the will in those creatures has not been liberated. There the spirit cares for what does not concern it, wills things contrary to itself and to one another, and in a word, is subject to distraction. This we are now supposed to have overcome, and surely the passions and illusions that are dead in ourselves are not to be replaced in us by adopting the passions and illusions alive in others. Only the clear spirit in each can be identified with the clear spirit in all the rest. The distracted spirit in the world will be succored with charity and not hated even in its madness, but only the liberated spirit will be embraced with joy. For this reason, hell does not poison heaven. The modern sentiment that heaven could not help being poisoned by the mere existence of such an eternal contradiction to its bliss, though generous, is not intelligent, as all truths fall together into the truth and are perfectly welcome to the intellect, all errors being understood and rejected. So all sane joys add themselves together, uncontaminated in the heart, when the heart is pure, while the sorrows and hatreds, though perceived, cannot be shared. Pain is itself a kind of hatred, and however intense it may be elsewhere, it cannot find its way into a free spirit. But this very freedom lifts the spirit, in its outlook and virtual attainment, into the presence of all good, wherever this good may be realized, so that it now clings to the earth and to its native soil only by the hidden roots of which it is unconscious, while its head flowers out and drinks the light from every quarter of the heavens. Self, so turned into a mere pedestal, ceases to intercept intuition, yet continues to make intuition a possible, temporal, and local fact, and determines its point of view, language, and perspectives. Spirit continues to live and to inhabit persons, but it feels no drag in this attachment. It can carry away and transform its body as it will, and rise into any heaven to which it has a natural bent. This I seem to see symbolized in the risen Christ, appearing unannounced, unrecognized, in various disguises, a real body, yet not as it was, the same person, and yet escaped from his trammels, having finished his mission, transmitting his work without regret or anxiety into other hands. There remain a few relics of the man, but the spirit has passed untraceably into new mansions. If we come sorrowfully at dawn to the grave where we thought he was laid yesterday, we behold young men, strangers, sitting by the stone that has been rolled away, and saying, "He is not here, he is risen. Why seek ye the living among the dead? He goeth before you into Galilee, there shall ye see him." Such is the escape or migration or resurrection of spirit horizontally, in the direction of further instances and developments. But there is also, and simultaneously, a possible liberation ideally in the vertical direction, when at any moment, or habitually, the spirit in a man recalls its universality, its merely momentary lodgment here, or preoccupation with this trouble, and expands intuitively into the equilibrium of all moments, and the convergence of all insights under the intense firmament of truth. Here there is no longer any pang of loss, any dubiousness in reunion, any groping in the twilight of birth and death. Birth and death have become integral to life, like the outburst and the close of a phrase in music. There are no winding sheets or sepulchres or embalmings. We have been initiated into the mystery of the divinity of Christ. In Adam, in the human psyche, the spirit is secondary, dependent, intermittent, only a point of view occasionally taken histrionically, by transcending animal egotism only the better to serve it. But in Christ, in the spirit that then enters into us, the opposite happens. There the center is divine, and what is put on like a garment or a dramatic mask is human nature. And though this assumption of humanity be voluntary, the very fact that it is voluntary makes it incomplete. The humanity that can coexist with divinity in the same person must be singularly chastened, subordinated humanity. Such, in fact, is the humanity depicted in Christ and admitted by Christians into their ideal of life. A divine person coming down into the world to redeem it could not adopt its errors or its vices. He could not even adopt its passions, however legitimate or inevitable in the natural man. He could not marry and have a family, claiming his special affection in contrast to mankind at large. He could not possess a home or a country that should tether his heart and compel him to defend them. He could not become a national hero like Joshua or Solomon or Ezra. He might speak figuratively and with great pity in his heart of the kingdom to come, but it was not one in which his disciples should sit on thrones, like Caesar, judging the nations. The first condition was that they should leave their nets by the seashore, take up their cross, and follow him. Nor was this a temporary repentance, because the end of the world was at hand, and it was not worth while making earthly provision. The end of the world is always at hand. The world is transitory, not only because our lives in it are short, but because it is unstable and contradictory and self-devouring essentially. In the true kingdom to come, in the soul transformed into spirit, there will be no anxiety about place or person, no marriage or giving in marriage, no pride of knowledge or power, no rebellion against suffering. These things are in the order of nature. The Father has ordained them. There can be no thought of abolishing them in their sphere. Christ himself came eating and drinking, living with the poor, and even feasting with the rich. Why not, when these things were profoundly indifferent in themselves, and the spirit could strengthen itself and pray in the midst of them, whatever they might be? Christianity was thus a fundamentally new religion, a religion of the spirit. It completely reversed the inspiration of the Jews and their frank, original hopes, and rather resembled Neoplatonism and Buddhism. The Jews did well, from their point of view, to reject it, and the Protestants, from theirs, to reform it, so as to revert to the cultus of marriage, thrift, science, and nationality. Nevertheless, a religion or philosophy without repentance, without disillusion or asceticism, reckons without its host. The Jews themselves produced Christianity, and the Greeks helped them to do it. After all, it is the spirit that makes human nature human, and in the confused, tormented, corrupt life of Christendom, not only do we find many a bright focus of mercy, sanctity, poetry, speculation, and love, and even the tone and habit of the common mind seem shot through with more wit and insight, more merriment and kindness, than in ages and nations that have never asked to be saved. Salvation is demanded, and in one sense is possible, because by virtue of his intelligence, man already has one foot in eternity. Each passion, each period of life, each political enterprise, after its heats are over, or even in the midst of them, when spirit shines through, enacts a tragedy which, though vain materially, need not be vain morally. Error and suffering, by the very change of heart that they provoke, may be offered up as a holocaust. Affections lost as joys may be preserved as allegiances, and all experience may be accepted for the insights which it brings, that is, to the spirit and for the spirit, because if after stumbling we merely plodded on, and if after dying we were merely made flesh again, the wheel of nature would go on grinding brutally forever, no music would be heard in those spheres, and the soul would have sinned and suffered, only to go on sinning and suffering unredeemed.